So this is our last lecture and it's on chapter 13 on speciation and extinction. And the quote there by Carl Sagan: "Evolution is dependent upon extinction and time." What it represents is time is required for the evolutionary events to have occurred, and extinction is important because that paves the way for new organisms to be able to come into being. So biological diversity, this is a term used to describe the different types of organisms that exist throughout the earth, and it's estimated that there's something in the magnitude of millions of species of organisms. It could be higher than that, we're not 100% sure. There's lots of organisms we do not know about. So biological evolution has produced a variety of diverse groups of organisms, and this is the mechanism of which the diversity of organisms have come into being based upon our current scientific knowledge. From bacteria to plants, animals, and fungi, basically all the organisms that exist. They all use the same molecules, the same DNA molecules, the same amino acid molecules, and the same general carbohydrates and lipid molecules. All of life is basically based upon 50, 60, 70 molecules, just oriented in different positions. So macroevolution is a term used to describe large changes over periods of time. And macroevolution is essentially speciation, the formation of new species. And species are the basic unit of organisms in an evolutionary sense. They share the same gene pool. Now, species can be broken up into different populations, but as long as they're considered part of the same species, they interbreed with one another. So Carl Linnaeus was a Swedish researcher. He is known as basically being the father of taxonomy, which is how we organize organisms, and the father of ecology as well, the study of the interaction between living organisms and the environment that they survive in. But one of the most famous contributions is what we call binomial nomenclature. This is a system for naming of species, and each species is given two names: a genus and a specific epithet. The genus is a more general name, and different species may keep the same genus name. But the specific epithet is specific for that particular genus, and the species name consists of both the genus and the specific epithet. So for example, our species name is Homo sapien. And organisms are grouped according to appearance. This is not an accurate way of organizing organisms. This is what Carl Linnaeus used back in the 18th century, but this is the best system that they had. So the species concept has been modified through time based upon new knowledge, but Ernst Mayr came up with what we call the biological species concept. This is a group of organisms which are capable of interbreeding with one another, and that's what defines a species, is its ability to interbreed with one another. But there's a problem with this, that most life does not reproduce sexually, but reproduces asexually. So how do you factor that into this particular species concept? It's very difficult. And then there's some organisms which are capable of reproducing, but they do not produce fertile offspring. So in that case, they're considered to be separate species. This is not the only species concept in use, but it's the most favorite, and it's considered to be the most popular. And it definitely works for sexually reproducing organisms. So the liger here is a good example. This is a cross between a tiger and a lion, when the lion is the male and the tiger is the female. Called a tigon if the tiger is male and the lion is female. But when they mate, their offspring are infertile, incapable of reproducing with one another. So there's some other problems with this biological species concept. One, it's impossible to apply to extinct organisms. How do you determine whether or not one particular form of Triceratops can mate with another form of Triceratops, or a Tyrannosaurus, or Plesiosaur, or etc., etc., etc.? It's impossible. You don't know if the two organisms that look alike necessarily could breed together. Some organisms interbreed in captivity, but not in nature. Does that mean we classify them as part of the same species, even though in nature their gene pools are isolated from one another? And for some organisms, reproductive isolation is not complete. We'll get a little later in here, but populations do weird things stretched over expansive spaces of time, expanses geographically. Sorry. The separation of a species is based upon reproductive isolation. This results in each group accumulating their own unique mutations. And what happens is when organisms are isolated from one another, then mutations occur, and they'll eventually not be able to breed with one another. So once again, the gene pool term comes into play here. So all the genes and alleles present within a population. Population genetics is a form of biology which studies the allele gene diversity within a population. This is a relatively new form of biology, only really popular like the last, 50 years or so. So what causes reproductive isolation? Mating between two populations are impossible to occur. Okay? So in the next couple slides, we're going to be discussing ways that organisms become reproductively isolated from one another. So the first one is what we call prezygotic. And this is a reference to the barrier which keeps organisms from being able to fertilize one another for the gametes, the sperm and egg to come together and form an individual. So one form of prezygotic reproductive barrier is ecological. If organisms live in different habitats or have different niches within an ecosystem, then they're incapable of breeding. So for example, in the rainforest, what people don't realize is if you go up the canopy of the trees in the rainforest, they're often split off into different zones. So there may be beetles that are found in different zones of the rainforest tree. Even though they live on the same tree, they may be found in different microhabitats of the tree, and so they're incapable of breeding with one another because they don't come in contact with one another. Temporal isolation. This is where organisms mate at different times of the year. Good example of this is the cicadas. There's some cicadas that are in a 17-year cycle. Every 17 years they come out of the ground and they mate. There's some that are in like a 13-year cycle. So these cicadas, they're isolated from one another because they mate during different time periods. Some organisms reproduce in the beginning of spring, some try to reproduce at the end of spring, etc. Behavioral isolation, organisms with different courtship rituals. So organisms have different forms of dance, if you want to call it that, that'll attract other organisms to each other. So depending upon the type of behavior you have, the type of courtship you have, it may isolate you from another group because another group is a different courtship. Mechanical isolation. The physical structure of the genitals do not match up with one another. When I was in graduate school, we worked on, I was part of a research program that was looking at zooplankton, these little floating critters in the water. They were microscopic in the various rivers and in Chesapeake Bay. One of the types of organisms we looked at were called copepods, and copepods generally range between 0.2 of a millimeter to 0.5 millimeter in size. And they had 5 pairs of legs on. They're arthropods, just like that of insects and crabs and spiders. And the 5th pair of legs were specific to the species. And the way it worked is the 5th pair of legs allowed the copepods to mate with each other if they had the correct shape. So if you had trouble identifying a particular copepod, because some of them looked very similar, you had to take the fifth legs off of the organism and examine them under a light microscope and determine what type of organism, what type of species it was. Now you can imagine how difficult it was taking the legs off of an organism, which is basically a 0.5 millimeter in size. It was difficult, but it was effective because then obviously if the legs didn't interlock with one another, they couldn't mate. So gametic isolation. This is where the gametes are incompatible. They do not fertilize one another. This is often what happens to organisms which are slowly drifting apart from one another. Um, they may mate with one another, but their mating is unsuccessful and it's a waste of energy. So post-zygotic reproductive behaviors. What happens to organisms after? If they're capable of somewhat reproducing with one another. One is called hybrid inviability. So in this case, the hybrid either dies during early development or sometimes before reaching reproductive maturity. The hybrid is very weak. It's very incapable of surviving. So hybrid infertility, animals develop and become adults but are infertile. So mules are a good example of this, and ligers and tigons are good examples of this. So tigons and ligers are only formed in zoo-like situations or captivity. They don't occur in the wild. Tigers and lions' ranges don't overlap with one another. Hybrid breakdown is where organisms are sometimes capable of reproducing, sometimes aren't. But offspring often have major genetic problems. So in this situation, you're basically on the verge of a speciation event occurring. It's true with all three of these. So hybridization is more common in plants and animals. Plants have very different reproductive strategies than animals do, and they're often capable of mixing genetics with other organisms much more frequently than animals are. So there are spatial, geographical patterns that define three different types of speciation that can occur within organisms. So changes in geography can lead to initial isolation of organisms. This is when we talked about the founder's effect. Okay, back in the previous lecture. This can result in either total physical separation of organisms or the result of different environments on species that stretched over a variety of different environments. We'll explain this in the next couple PowerPoint slides. So an allopatric speciation is a result of a complete separation of species into two populations and kept physically apart from one another. So for example, the Galapagos tortoises are found on different islands. Now when the tortoises landed on these various islands, they were each separated from one another, and they each maintained their own genetic history and their own mutational history, which led to different species occurring on the different islands. Another good example of allopatric speciation is when a mountain range forms. When a mountain range forms, it'll completely separate organisms apart from one another. Maybe not birds per se, but definitely in the case of, like, say, small mammals or reptiles or amphibians and such. So allopatric speciation is probably the easiest way for speciation to occur because you're physically separating a population out into two populations. So island formation, tectonic plate movement, the motion of the continents, when all the continents were together and then they separated from one another. The temporary development of freshwater systems, ponds, lakes, rivers, and streams. There are roughly about 40,000 species of fish. There are 20,000 species of freshwater fish, roughly about 20,000 species of saltwater fish. Now, when you think about it, liquid fresh water represents roughly about 1% of all the water in the earth versus something like 97% of the water is salt water. The other percentage is frozen water. So you're probably thinking, well, why is half the species of fish in the fresh water and only half in salt water? When it comes down to it, though, salt waters are more continuous. It's harder for speciation events to occur. But there are lots of these little ponds and little rivers and little streams, little lakes. And each one of them has their own assemblage of fish, and there's much more easier chance of organisms being isolated from one another and speciating from one another. So parapatric speciation. Para means next to. And what we're saying here is you have organisms that are spread out over large expanses, large geographical areas. Okay, and they're stretched over different environments, and because of this, the organisms have slight variations amongst these various populations. And what happens is organisms in different areas may not be capable of breeding with one another, but some are. So you'll have an evolutionary event where organisms on either extremes are incapable of breeding with one another, but their genetics are capable of getting from one side to the other because various populations in between are capable of breeding with one another. Figure 13.7 in your book shows a good example of the little green bull, the species found in western Cameroon. And the birds are capable of breeding only with certain populations. So here is the Laurus gulls. These are a group of seagulls found in the Arctic, and various populations are capable of breeding with one another. So you have up there 7 populations. So if you notice, the population in Scotland, number 7, is capable of breeding with the species found in North America, which is capable of breeding with the species found in Siberia, which is capable of breeding in another population in Asia, another population, and a population in Norway, number 1. But number 1 and number 7 are incapable of breeding with one another. When they attempt to breed with one another, they do not have functional offspring. They're infertile with each other in that case. But still, at the same time, the genetics of the population number 7 can get to the genetics of population number 1 through this ring species. So do you call these separate species? Or do you call them part of the same species? Because number 1 and 2 would be part of the same species, so would 2 and 3, so would 3 and 4, so would 4 and 5, so would 5 and 6, and so would 6 and 7. But 7 and 1 wouldn't. So this is one of those quandaries within evolutionary biology and the whole species concept. So allopatric speciation involves a speciation event where organisms are completely separated from one another. Parapatric speciation is where there's a bit of a quandary over what you call a species. Sympatric species is where species events occur even though organisms are found in the same environment. Now this usually is involved in an area that's very heterogeneous, meaning it's an area where there's lots of different little micro niches. So an example of a sympatric speciation event are the cichlids found in Lake Ijajam in Cameroon. And what happened is the cichlids came to these areas and they went through what we call adaptive radiation. They were one of the few fish found in that environment, and they took over a variety of different niches. Okay. Cichlids became specialists in what they fed on. As a matter of fact, some cichlids are so specialized they only eat the fish scales of certain other fish. Okay. So, but within this environment, these cichlids radiated and took over. So this is one of the examples why freshwater systems have so many different species in comparison to their volume than that saltwater. Because here you had one fish land in an environment, and it speciated out into all these variety of different species. Versus a saltwater system, that would never happen because the variety of species are already there. So plants are highly susceptible to sympatric speciation, and this is because plants go through polyploidy. So what will happen is you have a plant not separate its genes during meiosis. So it'll be diploid or tetraploid, and it'll reproduce with another plant. And then the plants will become octoploids or something of that nature. And then the plants can reproduce asexually. Matter of fact, there's a whole forest in Eastern Europe that basically consists of one tree. It's one tree that's continually sprouted itself over and over again throughout the woodlands through its root system. And through genetics, we've determined that this is one tree. So what will happen is you'll have a single tree that'll go through polyploidy. It won't be able to breed with other trees around it, but it'll be able to breed with its own self eventually as it grows throughout its own system. And through this, it'll form a whole new species. And this happens quite frequently in trees or in plants in general. So the rate of speciation, this is something which has been very much debated upon amongst scientists. This is There are two theories involved with this. One is the theory of gradualism. The theory in your textbook, the real term is called phyletic gradualism. And the other theory is what we call punctuated equilibrium. Now, I personally think it's a combination of two, but we're going to discuss these two theories of how speciation occurs. So gradualism is championed by geneticists and Charles Darwin himself, and they study the steady mutation rates that occur between generations of organisms. For example, they'll take fruit flies and reproduce them over and over again, bacteria, and they'll watch the bacteria grow on a petri plate. Okay, and they'll watch this over and over again, and they'll see the steady little changes in the organisms. Now, some say the fossil record suggests a more rapid succession, more rapid speciation events, because the fossil record will show an organism staying the same over millions of years, and all of a sudden abrupt change over 10,000, 100,000 years. Okay. Foraminifers and other small organisms, they'll show gradualism in the fossil record. They'll show steady little changes throughout. So it just depends on how you look at it. So punctuated equilibrium is championed by paleontologists and paleobiologists. One of the big people who supported this is Stephen Jay Gould, who passed away about a decade ago. But these state that organisms stay the same for long periods of time, genetic equilibrium, but then are punctuated by sudden bursts of evolution due to the opening of niches. The term sudden, you have to take that into a geological perspective. Sudden isn't what you think of sudden. Sudden is 100,000 years, is what we're talking about here. Okay, so longer than the expanse of human civilization. So reality, both gradual and punctuated equilibrium probably have their moments in time. All species change steadily throughout time. All species have mutations that occur, but often those mutations are drowned out and lost. Any attempt to change your species probably will be unsuccessful because you'll be competing against organisms which are already established in that particular environment. There are organisms which have stayed the same for extensive periods of time. The coelacanth is an organism which has stayed the same. Horseshoe crabs have stayed relatively the same. Now, there are different species of horseshoe crabs in the fossil record, but there are quite a few horseshoe crabs which have stayed the same over extensive periods of time. Okay, then you have moments where there are big changes in organisms, such as the mammals after the Cretaceous. Okay, mammals radiated and took over a variety of different situations. So adaptive radiation is what we're talking about when we're talking about those punctuated events. So these are events where organisms take over niches that they were unable to take before. Darwin's niches, the cichlids in Africa, dinosaurs in the Mesozoic, and mammals in the Cenozoic. So every single time you have a mass extinction event, it leads into what we call adaptive radiation afterwards, or every time a new island forms and organisms propagate there, get there, transport themselves there, then they will go into an adaptive radiation mode quite frequently. This is the whole reason why islands have their unique forms of species. It's the whole reason why the Darwin finches are unique versus the finches in South America. So extinction was something which was thought of never occurring in the past, but it turns out extinction occurs quite often. There's what we call background extinction rate. So there's extinctions that occur all the time. Species go extinct because their populations drop. When populations drop, they're incapable of surviving because they don't have the genetic diversity to survive. And then you have what we call mass extinction events. These are where you have colossal events occur where huge amounts of organisms go extinct. Massive volcano events could lead to this, such as supervolcanoes. Asteroids and comets crashing the Earth, and that's a common one most people know about. Interstellar gas clouds is an hypothesis as something which would cause a mass extinction event. The whole premise of this is that the Earth the Earth and the solar system is moving throughout space, and on occasion the Earth and the solar system may enter into what we call an interstellar gas cloud. And when that would occur, the dust that would come into our solar system would block the sunlight from the sun. Now, we're not sure if this ever actually happened or not, but it is an hypothesis and could happen in the future. So biological classification, how we organize organisms. Now, we have to organize organisms into groups because our minds are finite in the amount of knowledge that they can hold. What would be best is to be able to identify every organism on the earth and give its own individual name, the same as we do with our species, humans. But it's impossible. So because of that, we group organisms. Now, systematics is the broad term for studying organisms and classifying organisms. Taxonomy is naming organisms versus phylogenetics is the study of the evolutionary relationships of organisms, how organisms are related with one another. So Carl Linnaeus developed a system which we use today, which is used to categorize organisms into taxonomic hierarchies. Okay? And when Linnaeus did it, he did it based upon a system that didn't include evolution, because evolution at his time wasn't a popular theory or in a known fact. That didn't come until after his time. So the basic unit is the species. So for example, our species name is Homo sapiens. We already discussed the binomial nomenclature. Cladistics is a method of understanding the evolutionary relationships of organisms. And what it comes down to is you're going to form what we call a phylogeny, which is a pictorial representation of the branching aspects of life. Think of like a family tree, where you have like you and your siblings connected to your parents, which are connected to their grandparents, etc. Okay? Well, the difference is you're just taking that to an extremely broader concept. So humans and chimpanzees and bonobos share a common ancestor. That common ancestor is shared between that of us, chimpanzees, bonobos, humans, and that of gorillas. And then you go further back, orangutans. You go far enough back and we share a common ancestor with fish. Go far enough back and we share a common ancestor with the invertebrates. Go far enough back we share a common ancestor with the protists. Go far enough back we share a common ancestor with bacteria, etc. Okay? So the term monophyletic. Mono means one. Phyletic in this reference means a clade, a group of organisms which are grouped together. And what it means is a group of organisms which shares a common ancestor. And this is what you're shooting for in cladistics. You're shooting for groupings of organisms which share a common ancestor. So the cladogram is a pictorial representation of the ancestry of organisms. So a lot of people don't realize that crocodiles are more closely related to birds and non-avian dinosaurs than they are to the other reptiles, lizards, snakes, turtles. As a matter of fact, lizards and snakes should be in their own group, turtles should be in another group, and crocodiles in another group. And what we have here is a bunch of figures in your book which represent cladograms, which demonstrate various hypothetical representations of evolutionary relationships between organisms. Figure 13.18 shows how birds, modern birds and Archaeopteryx share the same characteristics and how they share an evolutionary history. And Archaeopteryx is an interesting organism because it shares characteristics of both what we think of classical birds and that of dinosaurs. They have long bony tails like that of dinosaurs. They have teeth in their beaks like that of dinosaurs, but they have feathers and wing-like structures like that of birds. So they're sort of a in-between that of birds and dinosaurs. So Occam's razor is more of it's a concept. It's not an hypothesis or theory within science, but it's basically a concept that often the most simplest explanation is the most likely explanation. And I like to think of this like, for example, when you're little. When you're little, you're running around, maybe you're hyperactive, and maybe you bump into a lamp, and your parents have been telling you to calm down for quite a while and everything, but you're not calming down. You knock over the lamp and you break it. So you come up with this wild story of how this lamp broke, and you say, "Oh, I saw this bird, and I opened the window, and the bird came flying in and knocked the lamp over, and the bird flew back out, and I closed the window. I was very sad, but that's what happened, Mom." And kids will tell stories like this, thinking like, "Oh, it makes perfect sense," and parents will believe this. But there's so many steps involved with that it becomes very complicated. Versus the most simplest explanations, the kid's hyperactive and knocked over the lamp, And that's probably the most true answer to the situation. So, Occam's razor is something that plays a factor in most of our everyday existence because it is the most likely explanation. Now, the parsimonious tree is the tree which demonstrates the least amount of evolutionary steps to be accurate. So this is probably the most accurate explanation. So for example, we and chimpanzee share a common ancestor because there's the least amount of steps between the common ancestor and us. Now, someone could say that, no, our most common ancestors are the mouse. But the mouse and us would require a lot more steps for us to become human versus us and chimpanzees. So there we call non-monophyletic clades. Clades that do not all share the common ancestor. Ones are called the paraphyletic clades. These are clades which do not include all the descendants of a particular ancestor. So if we want to keep birds and dinosaurs separated from one another, that would be a paraphyletic clade, because birds and dinosaurs share a common ancestor. Now in the past, birds and dinosaurs were considered separate groups of organisms. But since then, we've kind of grouped them together because they share a common ancestor. Crocodiles and birds should be grouped together more closely than crocodiles and lizards and snakes, because crocodiles and birds have more characteristics that are similar to one another. The polyphyletic clades are really what you're against. This is where you take organisms and you group them together even though they don't share a common ancestor with one another. Protists are an example of a polyphyletic clade. Protists were grouped together because they didn't fit any of the eukaryotic organisms, fungi, plants, and animals. But certain protists led to fungi, certain protists led to plants, and actually the same protists led to fungi led to animals as well. And certain protists went their own ways. But protists are a very diverse group of organisms, and they're actually working on this. They're actually working on grouping these out. And right now, we have basically sort of 6 kingdoms of life. Eventually, in the future, there are going to be many more kingdoms once we separate the protists into different groups of organisms.